Texas Monthly.
Hey, and welcome to a special bonus episode of Viva Tejano, a Texas Monthly podcast about Tejano music told by the people who make it and live it. I'm your host, JB Salceda. We recorded this episode just for you and the other Texas Monthly audio subscribers. And if you've enjoyed listening to Viva Tejano, I think you'll love this sneak preview of another project coming later this year. My guests on this episode are the filmmakers behind an upcoming documentary about Johnny Canales called Take It Away, The Rise and Fall of Tejano Hollywood. Adrian Arredondo and Myrna Perez spent years working on the film, getting to know Johnny near the end of his life, and talking with his family and friends in the industry. The film tells the story of Johnny's life, how he went from singing on the migrant farm worker circuit to hosting a show that played across the Western Hemisphere. And it also tries to answer a question I've been asking all season on this show. What happened to Tejano music? All right, here's my conversation with Adrian Arredondo and Myrna Perez. Cool. So I want to kind of just start with some context and just understand a little bit about the two of y'all and how you ended up in this project.
Yeah, so I was working on the Selena campaign for the Netflix show back in, I believe it was early 2020 or mid 2020, and I had to license some footage from the Johnny Canales show. And I started calling Telemundo, and I started calling Univision, and I started calling all these different networks that had the show on the network, and nobody seemed to own the footage, and nobody seemed to know what I was talking about. And so at that point, I had to kind of get creative and figured out Johnny and Nora's contact information. They, of course, didn't answer me for months because they were like, who is this woman? And eventually Nora answered me, and she was like, who are you? And what do you want from me? And I was so excited that she had finally responded. And we ended up forming a relationship at that point where we would just like talk sometimes in the evenings, and she would tell me about her life and I would tell her about mine. And at one point she was like, we have this barn full of archival. Would you want to do something with it? And do you want to tell Johnny's story? And at that point I was like, not really. Like, I have a job and I have things that I need to do. I started calling my friends that I knew were from the Valley. And so I called one of my friends, Fidel, who's in the film. And I was like, do you know anything about this? And do you think this is a good idea? And his first response was, did you just scoop me? And I was like, first of all, what does that mean in journalism terms? I don't know what that means. And he was like, well, I'm actually writing a story about Johnny Canales right now for the LA Times, because he's a journalist at the LA Times. And I was like, oh, okay, so this is a thing. And then I called Adrian, who's another one of my friends that is from the Valley. And I was like, do you know about this? And he was like, yes, I do know about it. And I was like, I need someone to help me with this because, Adrian has a different skill set than I have. And he's also from the Valley. And I was like, I feel like this could probably work. And so then we started working on it. I believe it was early 2021.
And what about you? I mean, when you got that call, Adrian, what was that like?
So Myrna and I have been friends for a long time. Originally, we met a few years prior to when she called me because we helped Zoe Saldana start a Latin media company in Los Angeles called Bice. So Myrna and I already had a really amazing working relationship as directors, as writers, as creative directors, as friends. And this call came years after we sort of had already, understood each other as friends and professionals. And I remember I was in Miami and I got a call one evening from Myrna. We hadn't spoken probably for a few months. And she's like, Adrian, I have, the story of Nora and Johnny Canales kind of here in my pocket. What do you think? Do you think that there's something that we could develop here? And I was like, of course, it's Johnny Canales. Like, to me, it seems so obvious, and it almost seemed like, why hasn't this been done before? So I got so hyped, and I was like, Myrna, we got to do this. We got to do this. We got to do it. Let's do it. And so we didn't really have like a plan to make a movie or a feature documentary that phone call. All we agreed to was, let's develop an idea. Let's go to Texas for a couple of weeks. Let's meet the family, and let's figure out the best way to tell the story. But we both had never made a movie before. So initially we both had this desire to make a feature film, and we've held on to that through the entire process over these last 4 or 5 years. And it got us here now.
Bienvenido al Alaska, Canadá, Estados Unidos, República Mexicana, Centro y Suramérica, donde quiera que nos estén viendo. Estamos en Laredo, Texas, right here, the All-American City.
When he passed away, for me, I described him as like this secret handshake for people that knew his show and like grew up on it like I did. It was like, it was a big deal to come home from church and to watch the show. But in the exploration with this podcast, one of the things that I'm constantly reminded of is just how many millions of people watched it. So like I say it's a secret handshake, but like a lot of people knew about who he was. How far reaching was his audience?
I was in Costa Rica in a tiny coastal town in end of 2021, and I was hanging out with a bunch of very random people that were all locals. And I remember mentioning that I was making this film, and all of them knew who he was.
Really?
And I was like, that is so crazy and weird.
I feel Johnny Canales was an icon in Texas, but his reach in Latin America, I think at this point today, maybe even surpasses his reach in the United States. Like Myrna said, having traveled in the last year since, really, really diving into the film, Colombia, Mexico, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, everybody recognizes Johnny. Anytime I've shown our film Instagram page or the trailer or even just mentioned it, I saw La Lome last night or 2 nights ago in Mexico City. They're a band out of Los Angeles, and afterwards, and we put some of their music in our film unbeknownst to them. But after the show, I went in and I was like, "Hey guys, big fan, great show. I actually want to talk to your manager about Johnny Canales because of this movie." And they, oh my God, gave me their personal Instagrams. Yes, please let us know how we can be a part of this. His audience is just so, they're not only like far reaching, they're just really kind people.
Well, I one of the questions I was really eager to ask you was, it feels like this really cool closed loop moment. For me, I had a really deep relationship with Tejano music and all of the music that he would play on the show as a child. And then I feel like I kind of, moved away from it in high school. And then like I get back into college and I'm like, YouTube's coming out and suddenly I'm discovering all of these old clips. And that has felt like the extent of my ability to kind of reconnect it. But y'all got to meet him and Nora, and then obviously go dig into these archives. What has that experience been like? Like, have there been clips that you've like discovered? You're like, oh, I got to remember this as a child. Talk to me about what the experience of diving into the deep cuts has been like.
Well, the deep cuts, I think, are my favorite part of the process. Originally, when we spoke about the idea and we planned our trip to Texas, we had heard about this mythical barn of 30 years of archival tapes, but we didn't know quite what to expect. But it's a literal, now it's a really nice studio, and Nora always like corrects us. She's like, it's a studio, it's not a barn. But the day we arrived, it was like, a big building that was kind of falling apart. There was no lights, but it was a treasure trove of not only media, but it's a museum, And so initially, like I had mentioned, Myrna and I didn't quite know the full story. We knew tidbits of Johnny's life and Nora's, life, but the real history and the real beauty is in all of the archival tapes. So the deep cuts were something that we had to watch so many episodes just to understand what story beats we would want to go after. And my favorite parts of that initial part of the archival research was a lot of the behind the scenes that does not involve the artist on the stage, but it's when the cameras are behind the scenes, Johnny's just being a normal guy, the artists are being goofy. You can see Nora messing up takes, and then also seeing so many artists that you cannot find on YouTube, on Apple Music, on Spotify, like the mariachis, like a lot of the conjunto bands, some Jose, sort of alternate songs that he performed specifically for the show, Selena tracks that, you can't license anywhere else. It's just amazing, and it's never ending.
Was that a production challenge for you, licensing these songs that get performed on these, one-time only live performances? Was that something that was a steep hill to climb, to have to go find some of these artists and management that may not even be alive anymore?
Yeah. For example, there's a bunch of Johnny songs that we're using that we have to license from Freddie Records. And that's been a challenge, just kind of getting in touch with people that maybe like haven't heard from anyone in a while. But otherwise, if you're listening to this podcast and you own some of this music, we would so appreciate the usage of it.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting to me to think about like the industry and the amount of change that it's gone through in 30 years. I mean, I imagine a lot of the people are much older or not even really in business anymore. Has that been the experience?
All of the artists that the Johnny Canales focuses on, a lot of them are still in business. A lot of them are not, but the ones that are quite old, and they're sort of passing the baton to the next generation, including Ramon Ayala, including Michael Salgado, Bobby Pulido, transitioning into this next phase of his career, sort of outside of music, into his personal interests. It's really interesting to see how multi-generational this is and how good of an understanding the artists, of that classic era, how self-reflective they are of the time and place that they were in and what they created, and how they can be useful now for the next wave of artists.
Yeah. But I think to me, what's most impressive is that like those artists are still performing. There was just a music festival here in Mexico City, and it's like Bobby Pulido was headlining. You have like all these other artists that were on the show that are headlining. Ramon Ayala was headlining Bésame Mucho in Austin. Like they are very much still active, and they're obviously older, but they have huge crowds and they're like legend status,
Yeah, I've been really fascinated by what I've kind of been describing as like nostalgia talk, and the amount of the incorporation of musicians like that into more like modern music a little bit. Seeing Bobby Pulido get brought in by Grupo Frontera to play Desvelado, and it's like they're all these much younger kids that are in their teens, early 20s, and they're freaking out about a song that my mom freaked out about in the 90s, and so there's like this new wave of music that is clearly influenced by their like Theos and Theas that they grew up in were around and watching party, but are now like the popular music. And to see it kind of being paying homage is really interesting to me. Like I love that, and I think it's not that I don't believe that there's other genres doing this, but there is something really interesting to me to see how much acknowledgement there has been for that kind of era of Tejano music. And do you think there's a big audience that's ready to kind of like relive some of that nostalgia?
Yes, nostalgia is something that we actively discuss between ourselves as filmmakers. We are very, very aware of that moment when someone sees their favorite artist on TV and they jump out the seat and they point at the TV and you're like, oh my God, I remember that person. I haven't seen them in 15 years. My mom did that when I showed her the cut 2 weeks ago. She just kept pointing at the TV, acknowledging some of her favorite artists. And for me, the nostalgia factor is not something I initially had focused on, but the more that we screen and develop and really lean into the archival, the more important I realize it is to not only show people their favorite artists, but to really contextualize the time, place, culture, music that was important and that got us to the Grupo Fronteras of today. So it's really amazing to, introduce nostalgia, but also introduce some more modern music, because then you have that contrast, and it feels a lot richer in the film.
I had an interesting conversation with El Dusty in which he kind of described, what he perceived as like some racism and resistance to adopting like, Tejano music or just like Texas Mexican music for a long time. But here more recently, it has become, in both his description and my perception, something that has started to influence more of like the broader Latin music genres. Do you think that Johnny's show has like helped helped that and like helped propagate the music that has historically been kind of seen as very Texan in nature and helped to incorporate into some of the other Latin styles of music?
100%. That's literally the entire story that we're telling in the movie. That's our entire thesis, is that there is a huge wave of música mexicana that has already exploded. And a lot of it is due in part because of the people that walked so that the Peso Plumas and the Yaritzas and the Grupo Fronteras could run. And I completely agree with El Dusty in terms of the way that Tejano music is looked down upon. And it was something that was very strange to me when I first started working on this project, because I was like, it all sounds so similar. Like, why is this one inferior and this one superior? I don't understand. But it's true. And I think the best part, like, I think the most incredible part about our movie is that we're shining a light on something that perhaps people didn't necessarily pay attention to or realize, and showing that a lot of the música mexicana explosion that's happening right now, particularly in the United States, is coming from not, newly arrived immigrants. It's coming a lot from people who have grown up here. It's like the U.S. Hispanic market of immigrants who are second or third or fourth, fifth generation American, but they're still immigrants, and they still, like you're saying, grew up with their parents' music. They still grew up with nostalgia. And so they're inspired by those sounds, in addition to, I don't know, reggaeton, right? You see Aritza y su esencia, very clearly Mexican music, but they grew up in Washington. They grew up listening to urbano music. And so of course their sound is incredibly particular, because they're taking the sounds of their parents and their grandparents while incorporating that with the current kind of like pop moment. And they're not necessarily Tejano, but you're seeing that also with Grupo Frontera.
With the production of the show, again, like I know what my experience was with it and the kind of, weekly ritual. But as I started doing the research for the podcast, and really even just to write his obituary for Texas Monthly, I really struggled to find a lot of information about Johnny. Like there was some debate, where was the show primarily produced out of, and I know it moved around a lot, but like I always thought of it as a Corpus thing. A lot of people thought of it as like a Brownsville, McAllen, South Texas thing. For someone who was so well known, why is there such little public information about him? Was he a really private person outside of the show?
I don't think Johnny was a private person. I think his goal has always been the opposite, to be the most prominent person on television, and also to elevate Latinos on television, specifically migrants, and people who sort of fall into that gray area of, we don't feel like we belong there. We don't feel like we belong here, but we feel like we belong in front of Johnny because he's one of us. And for that reason, I think his audience, like, we'll call it niche in the sense of the larger, like, North American sort of like generally English speaking audience. But like I said earlier, he's huge in Latin America because the Spanish language really carried him south. And when his show expanded and it did eventually grow and it became syndicated sort of globally, like that syndication came from Latin and Mexican networks. So maybe in the United States, maybe in Austin, Texas, 20 years later today, there's not a lot of people that sort of remember his show. But if you go down to, like you mentioned, Corpus, the Valley, McAllen, Reynosa, Monterrey, Mexico City, people still will replay the show on their own. They go to the Facebook, they go to the Instagram, they watch the nostalgia clips. And as far as him being a private person, Johnny was just always himself. And I think he always fought to keep the show going. And sometimes, that kind of fought him back. Time and technology sort of caught up. And as we know today, you're only as relevant as the next day's social media sort of rollout. So things are so different than they were 20 years ago. And at this point, it is pretty difficult to find things around him. Like, we had to go to Texas for 2 weeks just to understand what we were doing.
I've thought about him a lot. And with Johnny's show, I always pointed to it feeling like you were also at the concert and you knew that there were other, people also watching it at the same time and having this experience and feeling almost like the party from last night kind of spilled over into the morning. And so it is interesting to think about like a show like that and how can it be recreated, because in some ways the technology has made it easier for people to have those shared experiences. But the fact that no one watches TV at the same time also kind of undermines some of, what made it really special. Did he lament or share any frustrations about how the media had changed over the years?
Honestly, I think it was more Nora and his daughters that were really considering the changes that were happening. Johnny, I think, was always focused on being a show and creating community. Like his goal was to give people something really beautiful so that they could come together around and they could celebrate Latin culture and music, point blank. Nora, specifically, when they met, she sort of took a role in his life as somebody who gave him a bigger vision, we'll call it. She really fell in love with this man, looked out for him, and started to treat the Johnny Canales show more like a business. And so she was really aware of the strategies, the networks, the audiences, strategies Johnny could take to create more momentum or expand into a certain territory. Johnny never really considered those things. He was just happy to host. So I think that there's like sort of like two parts to the Johnny Canales show. There's like the part where Johnny was a single man just on stage, just, growing as a musician. And then there's a part where he's a family man and he has responsibilities to take care of his children. And with that comes a new understanding of, yourself as a professional, of finances, of strategy, of future planning. So, and they kind of coincided at the same time with like the Y2K technology boom, in the rise of the internet, the rise of YouTube, the rise of Napster and LimeWire, and people discovering music on their own. And all of a sudden, that's the funnest thing to do, right? To lock yourself on the internet and start downloading things versus turning on the TV on a Sunday morning and waiting for them to come to you.
What are your hopes for the documentary? What are you most motivated by, and what are you most excited about?
I just want as many people as possible to see it. It's because it's sort of what you're saying, where Johnny was always someone who didn't really get his flowers. And so we're really hoping that as many people as possible can watch it, or at least that's what I'm hoping. And I think for me, you bring up this like passion, nostalgia thing. And I think for Adrian, that's very much true. I think for me, because it's not a nostalgia thing for me, I didn't grow up with this. It's about the relationship and the respect that I have with Nora and the girls and family. I feel like I've already gotten what I wanted with that, in the sense that they watched the film and they loved it and they were crying and it was a whole thing. And they just felt really seen by it. And for me, that's everything. And I think it's having as many people as possible watch this and make sure that somebody who really paved the way for all these huge artists that are having this moment, to see that, you don't just get here without the greats paving that way for you.
I definitely, we did share a really beautiful moment with Nora and the family a few weeks ago when we showed them the film. I was so scared to show them the movie, and Myrna just was like, here's the link, watch it today. And I freaked out the day that she sent it. I was like, no,
it's great. Why would we be scared? They're gonna love it.
I know. I was scared because there's such a prominent part of the film that I wasn't even thinking about the story of Johnny. In my mind, I'm like, Nora's gonna see herself in this scene, this scene, Celeste Miroslava, this scene, and they're gonna naturally just have reactions. And I don't know, I care a lot, so I was nervous, but after they watched it, they loved it, and they said the nicest, most sweetest things. And so, like Myrna said, I already feel like we did more than what we needed to do in terms of accomplishing something that feels honest and true to not only the family but to the roots of Tejanos, a migrant culture, Tejano Hollywood, which is something that we, it's the name of the part of the name of the movie, something that we really, really, really dive into. The peak pop Tejano Hollywood that rivals the peak pop música mexicana that is today. And like Myrna said, our thesis is that when you see our movie, you will see how big this was, and you can compare it to today. It rivals, if not surpasses, everything that Latinos, Hispanics feel, is happening with music today. The other thing that I really, really hope happens with our movie, and something that I'm really excited for, is I believe that multilingual media and bilingual media is the future. Today, there are not many case studies of films, televisions, podcasts that are in English and Spanish at the exact same time. Our film is completely bilingual. It is totally embraces Pocho Spanish. It embraces two languages at the same time. Sure, it's a nightmare for us to have to caption and subtitle things, but at the same time, it's a beautiful thing. So what I hope our movie does is, I hope that it does what the Johnny Canales show did, which is give people who speak multiple languages and whose brains are equally as strong in both places a place to sit down and activate all parts of themselves. I want this to be that movie.
I think that's a really interesting comment, because something that I brought up with people a lot is that as a, firmly, I'm sure y'all are familiar, but like a no sabo kid myself, like I grew up in a firmly Tejano household where my parents didn't want us to grow up speaking Spanish. I grew up outside of Houston, and it was just like a decision that they made. And it put me in a weird middle spot where I embraced that music. I had, friends of mine, Caucasian friends, that loved when I would play Tejano music, and they'd say play that squeeze box music when we're out at their ranch or whatever. And they liked it. And it that was empowering for me to feel them liking the culture and liking the music. And, but at the same time, sometimes feeling a little excluded by, family or people who were like, man, I can't believe JB doesn't speak Spanish, So I was excited to hear that this documentary came out, and it very interested to hear how y'all would navigate some of this.
In the film, we do have scenes, particularly not only going into no sabo culture and Pocho Spanish, but we carefully cast, some characters that could really identify and explain to people what that is, and also who are very confident in themselves within that space. Because, like you said, it is something that is super nuanced, and you really have to see the rainbow of sort of Spanish speakers to be able to understand how different it is. But I really appreciate you saying that, because that you are the audience, you are the type of person that this is exactly made for.
And it's just proof that the human interest is common. The language is irrelevant. It's the human interest that is common. And I think that, there are a lot of people who love the music that is being promoted and celebrated today that would have a lot of interest in understanding where it came from. You feel seen, you feel heard. It's a cool moment. It's a pervasive culture, and I'm excited that more people are going to, more deeply understand it.
Adios, Mexico. Adios, Mexico.
All right. That was my conversation with Adrian Arredondo and Myrna Perez. Keep an eye out the next few months for their documentary about Johnny Canales. Take it away, The Rise and Fall of Tejano Hollywood. Thanks so much to Adrian, Myrna, and thanks to all of y'all for listening. Adios. Viva Tejano is a Texas monthly podcast hosted by me, JB Sauceda. Our executive producer is Megan Kreit. The show is produced by Ella Kapakin and Patrick Michaels, and produced and engineered by Brian Standifer. Additional production by Aisling Ayers. Consulting producer is Adrian Arredondo. A huge thanks to our partners, Myrna Perez and Adrian Arredondo, for access to the Johnny Canales Show archives. Keep an eye out for the upcoming documentary, Take It Away, which chronicles the rise and fall of Tejano Hollywood. Artwork is by Jen Hare Tompkins and Victoria Milner. Thank you all for listening. Adios.